The theme of this year's API Days conference is Platforms, Products and People, the power of APIs in the age of AI. Now, I want to focus on the people part of this prompt. Engineers are people who use API documentation. How can we best enable the engineers who use that documentation? What do we know about our cognitive capabilities as people and how we learn? How does it change when we use AI? These questions underpin my presentation, User Brainpower versus AI Blind Spots in API Docs. It's about how to optimize API documentation to maximize user brainpower, taking into consideration that the user might also be using AI. It explores the blind spots of AI to explain what sort of strategy is required when creating API documentation. My name is Rebecca and I've been working in technical communication in the fintech industry for 9 years. I work at nCino, a global company that builds banking solutions for financial institutions. In my role as a technical communicator, I work on a variety of documentation, including, more recently, API documentation. nCino was recognized as one of the world's top fintech companies in 2025, and it was listed on the AI Fintech 100. So it's no surprise that at nCino, I use AI to help with editing API documentation. I've seen what results you can get when you use AI superficially without a strategy, and how it improves when you use a strategy that I will share with you today. First, I will explain what I mean by user brainpower. Then I will explore AI's blind spots and how that affects the user. I will then explain the strategy I use and share some API documentation examples to demonstrate how this strategy improves API documentation. We can think of user brainpower as the finite cognitive resources that users, engineers, have available for problem solving, learning, and creative work. When we give a user access to documentation, we are trying to maximize their brainpower to achieve their goals as efficiently as possible. This means we need to be aware of their cognitive load. In cognitive load theory, there are 3 types of cognitive load: the intrinsic load, the effort required to solve the actual problem; the germane load, the effort to build an understanding with mental models; and the extraneous load, the effort to sift through irrelevant, poorly presented information. To think and learn efficiently, people need to use their brainpower on the intrinsic and germane load, but the extraneous load gets in the way. Let me give you an example. If I asked you how many ways you could solve this problem using the numerals provided, you are likely to spend some of your cognitive load on converting the Roman numerals to numerals that you're used to. Poor documentation, like overcomplicated problems, creates an extraneous load for the user. It takes brainpower away from solving the real problem they want to solve. When users engage with our APIs, we want them to be able to access their full brainpower, regardless of how they engage with the documentation. Some engineers might directly read API documentation. Others, as is more likely at this point, might use AI. This could be through direct interaction with an AI to get information, asking questions to get answers. Or it might be through indirect interaction, where the agent performs a series of tasks and uses the API documentation without there being an explicit conversation about it. Cognitive load theory matters even as users take more distance from reading documentation directly. When AI is involved with the documentation, reading or writing it, user brainpower is at risk of being burdened with the extraneous load of irrelevant and poorly presented information. This is due to AI's blind spots. AI is a powerful tool that has changed our world, and it has blind spots. It has limitations we need to be aware of. If we do not use AI with a strategy in mind, we risk burdening the user with an extraneous cognitive load that consumes their brain power. Out of all the opinions and information out there about AI's limitations, perhaps what is most compelling is what we learn from the AI creators themselves. Anthropic, as you probably know, is the creator of Claude AI. And Anthropic has its own AI fluency course on developing AI competencies. This course identifies several limitations with AI models, including incorrect information, the inability to confirm if provided information is correct, hallucination, the propensity to reach incorrect conclusions, context window, the limited memory for each interaction, and non-deterministic output, the tendency to provide varied responses. An example of non-deterministic output is this. If you ask Claude, what is the ideal character count of a parameter description? It might say from 50 to 300 characters, or it might say from 40 to 100 characters. The answer varies in every conversation. That's non-deterministic output. Of course, having incorrect information or hallucinations is going to pose a problem when it comes to API documentation. The engineer is going to waste cognitive resources on troubleshooting and rework. AI's context window means that in lengthy operations, the AI might run out of memory before the task is completed, before the user can solve the real problem. They're wasting resources on the extraneous load rather than the intrinsic load. As for AI's non-deterministic output, this variability might hinder the user from building a mental model, especially if the user cannot depend on the accuracy of what the AI is saying due to the other limitations that we mentioned. Anthropic's course even says, creative variability can be great for brainstorming, but requires awareness when consistency or accuracy are critical. In API documentation, consistency and accuracy are critical. If we have inconsistent API documentation to begin with, AI might just cause even more confusion. Here is an example of how inconsistency in documentation ultimately requires additional cognitive load from a user. We have 3 API endpoint descriptions, each one worded quite differently. A user might wonder, what does it mean by the package's endpoint supporting bulk operations? Does that actually mean that it creates one or more records in the system, like the shipments endpoint, but for packages instead? Hypothetically, let's say the user sends these descriptions to an AI for guidance. This is how the conversation unfolds. The AI concludes, supports bulk operations means the endpoint can create one or more package records in a single request, just like the shipments endpoint does for shipments. The 3 descriptions say the same thing but use different wording. And maybe it was correct, but maybe it was not. So let's press a little bit further. Is there a scenario where your interpretation might be incorrect? And the answer is yes. The different wording suggests there might be a meaningful distinction. Maybe it has a separate bulk mode. Maybe it only creates in bulk. Maybe it has bulk-specific features. Herein lies the problem with inconsistency. Neither the AI nor the user know whether the distinction was meaningful. Such a distinction might just have been created by using AI to document separate endpoints where the non-deterministic output created variability. And now the onus is back on the user to check various other things to validate their interpretation of the documentation. A user might not directly read API documentation, but if the API documentation contains variability, inconsistency, a lack of standards, using an AI as a mediator only passes on the problem. The user then has to use additional cognitive resources to understand a problem that was created through poor documentation, even if the user only interacts with AI. The solution to this, is to create standards for your documentation. When you don't use standards, this is what happens. You build an API endpoint. You pass the documentation through AI. Maybe you just say, improve writing, or you might get it to create a new document entirely. It produces an API document that seems to have everything you need. You build another API endpoint. You pass that documentation through AI. Its non-deterministic output introduces variability. Variability is introduced every time you pass API documentation through AI. In isolation, each document might seem fine. However, when a user directly or indirectly accesses this system of knowledge, they are seeing a lot of variability. Like Claude said earlier, the different wording suggests there might be a meaningful distinction. When you create a standard, you're making strategic decisions about what is important across your system of information, not just the endpoint you just completed. This is not just a formatting exercise, although being specific about formatting can help. Creating a standard requires research, discussion. You are limiting variability and you are making a communicative commitment to the user. Any different wording exists only when there is a meaningful distinction. In other words, you are preparing for AI's blind spots so you can maximize user brainpower. When you have your standards, you can standardize your API documentation. It's also likely that you will need to revise and review your standards as you continue to develop your application programming interface. That way, when we pass APIs through AI, we are maintaining the standard. There's less variation, less of an extraneous cognitive load for the user. I'm going to go through some fictional API documentation, examples that I've created to demonstrate how to standardize information. Here is a pretend developer portal. My fictional logistics company, Swella Tech, has multiple collections of APIs for different products. We have several different cards, and each one seems to describe the sort of APIs you can find inside. However, the level of variability here is confusing. If there is a communication strategy, the strategy is unclear. All the descriptions are doing different things. US shipping says what it's for. ML Analytics lists API documentation as just one learning resource among many. Payment processing exclaims with a call to action as though it belongs in an advertisement rather than a developer portal. International shipping contains the only description that says it's for outside the US. Enterprise solutions somewhat states the business purpose, but overall there is still no consistency. If you put each of these separately through AI to improve writing, as you are building the APIs, it will suggest alternative descriptions. However, these also have variability and still no strategic cohesion. There are several strategic decisions that we can make around what we think the user needs to know. Do they need to know which geographical market the APIs are for? Do they need to know what kinds of learning resources are available? Do they need to be told what they can do with the APIs? When you say yes to one approach, you're saying that everything else must adhere to that approach. Every approach requires different facts to be checked, and for every new collection of APIs to follow the same standard. Here is a standard that you might end up with. If you have sufficient information, you can run the existing descriptions through AI with this prompt. This sort of formula makes it explicit what kind of format or structure you want to use, which ensures consistency. It contains a lot of strategic decisions. We are action-oriented. We are not telling the users if there are tutorials available. We're concise. We're only going to talk about the location if it's needed, and we define needed to mean shipping APIs only. Taking this holistic, systemic approach will make our developer portal more consistent, like this. These formulaic descriptions are easier to read, strategic, and reduce the extraneous cognitive load that might otherwise arise when an AI or a human is reading the documentation. Now let's take a look at specific endpoint descriptions. These are all post endpoints, but they're described differently. Even looking at the first few words, we can see that there is no standard. What happens if we just run them through AI and ask it to standardize them? We might copy and paste our descriptions into a prompt like this. And there is some consistency here, but there are still differences which are not necessarily meaningful. Does the user need to know that there are tracking capabilities? What's the difference between a system and a database? How much do our endpoints differ when it comes to flexible reporting options? By using these descriptions, we're still not yet being strategic. Sometimes, strategic standardization can look like oversimplification. This is very consistent and very basic. It might even seem meaningless compared to what we had before. However, in a meaningful system, the simple standards create clarity and make automatic sense. Get endpoints retrieve, put endpoints update, post endpoints create. The level of detail you include is strategic. Let's end with one more example where it's perhaps clearer how we are making strategic decisions when we create standards. The customer string parameter is used in 3 different endpoints: get orders, post payments, and get shipment history. These descriptions of the parameter might all be correct, but they are inconsistent and create cognitive load when we try to equate them to each other. It's like the equivalent of us trying to convert Roman numerals into numerals that we recognize in our earlier maths problem. Here are 2 different ways to standardize these parameters. Neither one is inherently better than the other one. They are suitable for different priorities and expectations. Standard A, where all the descriptions are just customer ID, is concise. But do we expect the engineer reading this documentation to know what that parameter means in each of these endpoints? Standard B is more descriptive and provides more context. Which approach is better? It depends on your documentation approach. What you simplify in one area must be explained somewhere else. If you used Standard A, would you explain these parameters in user journeys instead? These are questions about what sort of commitment you are making to the user as you communicate with them. These are questions about how you empower your user to think efficiently. That is the strategy behind standards. I'll leave you with this. The power of APIs in the age of AI can only be harnessed if we consider the user's cognitive load and AI's blind spots. As creators of APIs and API documentation, we can and should use AI to help. But let's not forget about the person on the other side, the person who is trying to build a mental model about how our APIs work with limited brainpower and limited tools. Today, setting standards is the best thing we can do for platforms, products, and, most importantly, people. Thank you for listening. I hope this was useful to you. If you're interested in learning more about cognitive load theory or AI fluency, check out these resources that I used. Have a great day.